of Kish, who is the descendant of Saul, will have the opportunity to be on the scene when the last Amalekite bites the dust, as it were. So since Haman is the last of the Amalekites, and it says in Exodus 17 that he would blot out his name, so when his name is mentioned, we participate with God in blotting out his name by using the noisemakers, boo and hiss, and so on and so forth. When we read about Mordecai, we can say, hooray, because he's our champion. When we read Esther, we can say, because she is the queen. Okay, you guys ready? All right. If you're armed, ready to go. Let me read to you from the book of Esther. We won't read every portion, but we'll take some highlights. In Esther chapter 1, the story opens up by telling us this is what happened in the days of Ahasuerus. In Hebrew, I always remember reading it in Hebrew, it's Achashverosh. So then when I saw the English translation, Ahasuerus, I thought, this is really strange, right? It's Achashverosh. But his name in Persian and in Greek is Xerxes. This is Xerxes the first. And he lived around 460 years before the time of Messiah. And he had an expansive kingdom. I mean, his kingdom went from India all the way to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, not today Ethiopia. Ethiopia today is south near Somalia. But we're talking about the Sudan, which is just south of Egypt, Upper Egypt. So his empire was expansive. It included parts of Europe, and that's why the Greeks will end up battling the Persians. It involved all the way to the east of India, all through what is present-day Iran and Iraq, Middle East, down into North Africa, and south into Egypt. In fact, the text tells us that he wanted to display the vast wealth of his kingdom and splendor and glory, so he threw a party for 180 days. That's like half a year. That was like a 6-month party. Who doesn't want to go to that? But it's not just one party. Actually, there are 2 parties. If you don't have to look, but in the book of Esther it says, in addition to the king's party, in which they were drinking all kinds of wine from all kinds of goblets made of gold and silver and all kinds of metals, it also says, in addition, Queen Vashti held a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes, or Achashverosh, or Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry, he decided that he wanted to bring his wife Vashti, who is beautiful in form and appearance, the text says, to present her before all of the peoples and officials. She was just so very attractive, my text says. But Queen Vashti refused to come. Can you imagine that? The queen refusing to obey the king? And the king became furious. He burned with anger. So the king had to figure out, what do I do about this? So he consults his wise men. And they say, hey, look, if you allow this to go on, imagine what's going to happen with all the women throughout the entire kingdom. If the queen won't obey the king, why should any of the wives obey their husbands? We can't have that, can we? No, of course not. We can't have that. And so the wise men tell the king, look, disperse with your wife, divorce your wife, get rid of your wife Vashti, and just get another wife. And so in verse 21, the matter pleased the king and the princes. And so it was decided that a message would go out throughout all the kingdom so as to find a new queen for King Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, or Achashverosh. So in chapter 2 now, after these things, this is an interesting passage. After these things, when the king's anger subsided, it says he remembered Vashti. He must have thought, what did I do? You know? He remembered her and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And so the king said, look, let's send out a message throughout the city of Shushan, the capital of Persia, throughout the empire, throughout our 127 counties or sections of the kingdom, and let's find a queen for you. So there was a Jewish man in the Shushan palace whose name was Mordecai. That doesn't sound like it just really didn't sound like you really cared much about Mordecai. Thank you. Mordecai appreciates that, and when you get to heaven and meet him, he will remember that moment. So, as I was saying, who had been taken in exile from Jerusalem with the captives, had been carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had taken away. He raised Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was attractive, had a beautiful figure, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her to him. Thank you. I almost missed that. I was just testing you. See? When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her to him as his own daughter. And the king's order and decree became known. Many young women were assembled in the palace of Shushan under the supervision of one of his elders. Esther also was taken into the king's household under the supervision of Haggai, guardian of the women. Now Esther had not disclosed her people, for she was a Jew, or her lineage, because Mordecai had commanded her not to make them known. And so every day Mordecai walked in front of the women's courtyard to find out how Esther was and what might happen to her. And when each young woman's turn came to go to the king at the end of 12 months of prescribed treatments, in the oils and in the beauty treatments and in the perfumes and spices, one whole year they treated them. Think about the spas around here. You go for a whole year before you're presented. I could use some help there, I'm sure. And so in any case, she was presented. Then she was presented to the king. And the king was pleased with her and summoned her by name. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes, because he chose her to be his queen. And he proclaimed a holiday for the provinces. They distributed gifts in keeping with the king's wealth. And when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her lineage or her people, just as Mordecai had told her. Esther continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Now in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the doorway, became angry, and they conspired to assassinate the king. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told it to Queen Esther. Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when the matter was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows. It was then written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So these two individuals who were at the king's gate, Mordecai overheard the plot to kill the king. And he then had that information distributed to the king. The king learned of this and had these two conspirators executed. So we go on. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Ammedatha the Agagite, elevating him. Agagite, he was a descendant of King Agag, whom Saul was supposed to kill, you remember? Elevating him and setting his chair above all the officials who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate, they bowed down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded it. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay him honor. Then the king, remember the things are with Haman. Right. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai,
Hooray!
"Why are you disobeying the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he would not listen to them. Therefore they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him honor, Haman was filled with rage. But it was repugnant in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him the identity of Mordecai's people. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So in the first month, that's the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast the poor, that is, the lot, in the presence of Haman, from day to day and month to month, up to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose laws differ from those of every other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let an edict be written to destroy them. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out this business to put it into the king's treasuries." The king took his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the son of Ammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver and the people are yours." Do you think I didn't see you take my grogger? That is the royal grogger. All right, just checking. So the king said to Haman, "The silver and the people are yours. Do with them as you please." So the king's scribes were summoned in the first month on the 13th day. An edict was written as Haman had commanded. So on this day, the Jewish people would now become open season for anyone in the provinces to kill them, to harm them, and to take their goods. And this edict that's signed with the king's ring, because in Persia the belief was that when the king signed an edict with his ring, it wasn't just the king signing it, but it was the gods of the Persians. Therefore, the edict could not be rescinded. It couldn't be just nullified, not even from the king himself. And so now the Jewish people are going to be open season, and there's nothing the king can do to change his mind. Chapter 4. When Mordecai, by the way, there's only like 30 chapters. No, there's only nine, so we're almost halfway there. And it's not even 1 o'clock yet.
Good preaching.
Thank you. You can't go wrong just preaching the Bible. Preach the word, you know. So here we go. Chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that was done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the middle of the city, crying out in a loud and bitter voice. He went only as far as the king's gate, because no one could enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the king's edict and law came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many put on sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, the queen was greatly distressed. She sent clothes for Mordecai to put on, so he would remove his sackcloth, but he refused. So Esther summoned Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs whom he had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to find the cause and reason for this. So Hatach went out to Mordecai in the city square, in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, even the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a written copy of the decree, which had been distributed in Shushan for their annihilation, to show to Esther and to explain it to her. He instructed her to go into the king, beg his favor, plead before him on behalf of her people. Hatach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatach and gave him instructions for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces fully understand that for anyone, man or woman, who approaches the king in the inner courtyard without being summoned, he has one law, that he be put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter, permitting him to live. But I've not been summoned to come to the king for 30 days. So they conveyed Esther's words to Mordecai. So Esther basically is saying, look, unless I go to the king, if I am not invited by the king to go to the king, and if he does not extend his scepter to me when I go to him, it will mean my life. And so she's concerned, she's scared what this might mean. And so Mordecai told them to reply to Esther with this answer: do not think in your soul that you will escape in the king's household more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have attained royal status for such a time as this? Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go, gather together all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast in the same way. Afterwards, I will go in to the king, even though it's not according to the law. So if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai left and did all that Esther commanded. Chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. So the king held out to Esther the golden scepter in his hand. And Esther approached, touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king to her, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever your request, even as much as half the kingdom, it will be given to you. So Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come this day to the banquet I have prepared for him. The king replied, bring Haman quickly, so we may do what Esther said. Then the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther prepared. And as they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, what is your request? It will be granted to you. Whatever your request, even as much as half the kingdom, it will be fulfilled. Esther answered and said, my petition and my request is this: if I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and my request, excuse me, then let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and they will do as the king requests. Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. However, when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, he did not rise or tremble before him. Haman was filled with rage against Mordecai. Hooray! Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, he had 10, and how the king had promoted him and exalted him above the other officials and servants of the king. Haman added, and that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me to accompany the king to a banquet that she prepared. And she also invited me along with the king tomorrow. Yet all this does not satisfy me as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, let them set up a gallows, 50 cubits high, 180 feet. And in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go happily with the king to the banquet. This idea delighted Haman, and he ordered the gallows to be built. Chapter 6. That night, sleep deserted the king. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read before the king. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had revealed that Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the door, had conspired to kill the king. The king asked, what honor or recognition has been shown to Mordecai for this? The king's servants that attended him replied, nothing has been done for him. The next day, the king said, who is in the courtyard? Now Haman had just come into the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servants answered, Haman, he is standing in the courtyard. The king said, let him come in. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? Now, of course, the king's thinking of Mordecai, who had saved his life. But Haman is thinking, who else could the king be wanting to honor than me? So Haman thought to himself, whom would the king desire to honor rather than me? So Haman replied, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be placed into the hand of one of the king's most noble princes. Let them clothe the man whom the king desires to honor and parade him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming, this is what is done for a man the king desires to honor. The king said to Haman, go quickly, immediately, take the robe and the horse, just as you suggested, for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything that you recommended. So Haman took the robe and the horse, robed Mordecai, paraded him through the city streets, proclaiming, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Afterwards, Mordecai then returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed to his home, grief-stricken, and with his head covered. Haman recounted to his wife Zeresh and all his friends and everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom you have begun your downfall, is of Jewish descent, you won't be able to stand against him. In fact, you will certainly fall before him. While they were talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hurried Haman along to the banquet Esther had prepared. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked Esther, whatever you request, even as much as half the kingdom, it will be given to you. So Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it pleases the king, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare the life of my people. This is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. If we had simply been sold as male and female slaves, I would have remained silent. For such distress would not be worthy disturbing the king. The king responded to Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man that presumed to do this? Esther replied, the man, the adversary and foe, is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Enraged, the king got up from the banquet of wine, withdrew to the palace garden. But Haman stayed behind to plead with Queen Esther for his life, for he realized that the king had determined a catastrophic end for him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the same couch where Esther was. The king exclaimed, will he also assault the queen while she is with me in the palace? As soon as these words came out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, look, behold, a gallows 50 cubits high is standing next to Haman's house. Haman himself made it for Mordecai, who saved your life. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's rage subsided. In chapters 8 and 9, because the king cannot annul the decree that has already been decreed, he issues a second decree. And in this decree, he allows the Jewish people to defend themselves. And as a consequence, they are able to do that, and they are able thereby to withstand the attack of the Persian people, the enemies of the Jews. The text goes on then to tell us in chapter 9, verse 20, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, urging them to celebrate the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year as the days when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into celebration. These were to be days of feasting, celebration, and sending presents of food to one another and giving gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the commemoration they had begun. That's what we do every year. That's what we're doing today, and that was what occurred, I think, Wednesday night and Thursday this past week. But that's what we're doing today. From the time of Mordecai and Esther, 640 years before the time of Messiah, we continue to celebrate Purim in acknowledgement and remembrance of God's great deliverance over Haman and our enemies. And so what we really celebrate is how God protects us from all of our enemies throughout all of time. So the Jews agreed to continue the commemoration they had begun and to do what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Ammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the poor, that is the lot, to ruin and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he issued a written edict that the wicked, scheming Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. For this reason, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. Therefore, because of everything in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews established and took upon themselves and upon their descendants and upon all, I love this, all who joined with them, that they would commemorate these 2 days in the way prescribed and at the appointed time every year. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, and in every province, and in every city. These days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor their remembrance perish from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and also Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes with words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and just as they had established for themselves and their descendants, matters regarding their times of fasting and lamentations. Esther's command confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written into the records. Chapter 49. No, chapter 10. Chapter 10. Last chapter. Now King Xerxes imposed a tribute upon the entire land, even to the coastlands of the sea. All the acts of his power and might, along with the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, and the story of how the king promoted him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai, the Jew, was second to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, held in high esteem by the multitude of his people. He sought their good and spoke for the welfare of his descendants. You know, I never get tired of reading this. You know, I never do. Do you get tired of celebrating this, you know? It's such a great reminder. It's such a wonderfully written event and chronicled event, and it's just a joy to reflect on. Now, let me just take 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Well, I'm watching the clock. And let me just share with you a couple of thoughts, and then we'll pray. The worship team can come up, and we'll sing to the Lord one last time in honor of what he has done. But what I wanted to share with you is this. A very common phrase that's oftentimes made reference to, and that is when Mordecai speaks to or gives the message to Esther, he says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Now, one thing you notice in the book of Esther, right, and we're all very familiar with this, is that never in the book of reference do we have reference to God, right? The Lord's name is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. But here he's sort of intimated, right? I mean, you have prayer, you have fasting, presumably prayer to whom? To God. But he's not made reference to. You have fasting so that who? God would intervene. But again, he's not specifically made reference to. And you have this great line, which says that, this is verse 14, for if you remain silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. So what is this other place? It would be from another person, right? Or from another source of some kind. It's all going to come from God. But someone or someone's or something, I mean, there could have just been an earthquake that gobbled up, all the people. Who knows? Something could have happened in order to bring deliverance to the Jews. But the important thing here, deliverance was coming to the Jews, right? Deliverance was going to happen. Whether Esther and Mordecai were the mechanisms or not, deliverance was going to come, and God was going to preserve his people. Why? Well, as I started the service this morning, when we all were just gathering, Malachi chapter 3, I think it's verse 6 or so, where it says, because I, the Lord, change not. Now, that's such an important phrase. God does not change. Theologians refer to that as the immutability of God. Being immutable means he does not change. It means that God's way remains the same. God's character does not change. So people say there's nothing God cannot do. Well, that's not really true. There are things God cannot do. Whatever is a violation of his character, he cannot do because he does not change. So God can never be unmerciful. He can never lack compassion. He can never not be loving and kind. He can never not be just. He can never not be holy. He can never not be unrighteous. He can only be what his character is. He can never be something else. And so because he's immutable, he has to be truthful. He can never tell a lie. That's why the scripture says God is not a man that he should lie. He cannot lie. It isn't that he simply doesn't lie. He is not able to lie. In other words, the phrase on the one hand saying being able not to lie or not being able to lie are two different things. So God is one who is not able to lie. That's an impossibility for him. And so what has he said about his people? He just told us in Malachi 3:6, because I am an unchanging God, because I cannot do that which I said I would do, therefore you sons of Jacob, I think it's interesting, Malachi doesn't say sons of Israel, but he says sons of Jacob, because remember, it was as Jacob he had sinned against his father by deceiving his father, right? He never sinned against Esau. He made a deal with Esau. Esau may not have liked the deal later, but Jacob made a deal that he agreed to. If I give you some food, you give me the right of the firstborn. And Esau, it says, despised his birthright. Jacob didn't take it from him. Jacob didn't steal it from him. He bargained for it, and he got a great deal because he knew a value when he saw one. And the things that God values are the greatest value. And the value of being the firstborn is greater than any other value. And he was identifying himself with the things that God identifies himself with. And so he valued the things of God. You remember when Esau and Jacob were being born? Jacob was holding on to the heel of Esau. He was trying to pull him back in so he could be born first. Because he valued the right of primogeniture, the right of the firstborn. Because with that right comes the patriarchal blessing. And the patriarchal blessing is the blessing that was given to Abraham and Isaac, that in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed, that in you would inherit this land that I'm giving to you and your descendants. And not only that, but he said to him that not only he would have a land, a great blessing, but that his descendants would be as the stars in heaven. Even before Jacob was born, he understood something of it because he was desirous of it. And if that sounds strange to you, in the New Testament, we already see the very same thing. Because you'll remember when Mary visits Elizabeth, even before John is born, he leaps in Elizabeth's womb, beginning to herald the Messiah. That's his job. And when Mary walks into the proximity of Elizabeth, even though both are unborn, John knows the Messiah is here and he's ready to do his job. He's heralding him. And so it says that he leaped in his mother's womb. Similarly, Jacob, even before he's born, he's valuing the things of God and he's trying to be born first. But then he does sin when he deceives his father. His father's blind. He takes advantage of his physical limitations. He can't see. So he puts on all kinds of hairy, sheepskin or whatever, to make himself hairy like Esau was. And then he takes the patriarchal blessing. That's true. But Isaac ought to have known better from the beginning. Because even before they were born, God told Rebekah that the elder will serve the younger. Isaac ought to have submitted to that and not withheld the blessing from Jacob anyway. But Jacob then takes that blessing. But it'll be later when he wrestles with the angel all night, who is the Lord in a physical form before his incarnation, because the name of the place is called Peniel, the face of God. He wrestles with the angel all night, and now his name is changed from Jacob, the one who had sinned, to Yisrael, a prince with God. What's interesting is Malachi says, because I, the Lord, change not, ye sons of Jacob. Despite your sin, despite your limitations, despite your weaknesses, despite your rebellion, because I, the Lord, change not, despite who you may be, you will not be consumed. I will be faithful to my promise, and I will preserve you from all harm. The book of Esther is one example of God's faithfulness to his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Lord makes a covenant promise to us as well through the Messiah. The greatest statement of it, in my opinion, is found by Paul in Romans chapter 8. Nothing can separate you from the love of God that is in Messiah Yeshua. Neither height, nor depth, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come. Nothing whatsoever can ever separate us from God's love in Messiah when we know him and when we embrace him and when we invite him into our lives. So let's pray. And while I'm praying, the musicians can come. Father in heaven, we thank you for this great word in the book of Esther, your faithfulness to your promises. And just as you promised that relief would come from another place, relief would come for your people. And relief has come for us. For Lord, like the Jewish people in the time of Persia, that were under the bondage of this decree that could not be changed or reversed, so we too are under the bondage of a decree that the wages of sin is death. Nothing can annul that. Nothing can change that. But a new decree has been issued in which Messiah has come and provided deliverance from another place when he took our sin upon himself. He bore our reproach and our transgression. And because of what he has done for us, we now can be the recipients of a new decree that we would have life everlasting and have it more abundantly. Why? Because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. If anyone here this morning has never invited Messiah into their life, has never said, Lord, forgive me of my sin, and may the decree of life be applied to my heart, you can do that this morning with a simple prayer. Lord, forgive me of my sin, and come into my life. And so just very quickly, if there's anyone here who has never done that and you would like to do that, just raise your hand and put it down very quickly. And we will pray with you that Messiah would be your Savior this day. If you know him, then pray that you would be one who would walk with him in a worthy manner that lifts up his name, brings glory to him, and seeks to follow him however he might lead. So Lord, we pray, and I pray that everyone in this room would be one who knows you. And if not, I pray that they would pray a prayer like this. Father, forgive me of my sin. Thank you for Messiah who died for me. Make me your own and lead me and guide me the rest of the days of my life. And I thank you for the gift of eternal life that you've provided for me. And for those of us who know the Lord, our prayer, Father, is that we might be courageous like Esther. We might be wise like Mordecai. We would be spiritually sensitive like him, to mourn when we ought to mourn, to cry out to you when we need to cry out, that we would fast on occasion to seek you, and that we would follow you and obey you. And we are blessed, Lord, to receive the great blessings that you have bestowed upon us. We glory in nothing but the atonement that has been provided by Messiah, and we rejoice in his love and in his grace, for it's in his name we pray. Amen. The ushers can come this morning, and if you've come to give a gift to Messiah, you can do that as they come. If you're a guest here this morning, please don't feel any pressure or compulsion in that regard, but just give as an act of worship to him as he leads and guides. As they come, we will sing to the Lord.